During the first half of the 15th century, Europe was a square peg in a round hole, a time and place caught between the modern and the medieval. What is true of the age is also true of the people, none more so than the rebels, misfits, and troublemakers, known to history as the Hussites. Though there's no understanding the Hussites without the backdrop of medieval politics, culture, and religion, theirs is also a strikingly new kind of story, one of reformation and revolution, of sectarianism and nationalism, of cannons and war wagons, of pistols and howitzers. In short, it is a story of invention born of necessity. From 1419 to 1434, the Hussites faced 5 crusades, 33 nations, and hundreds of thousands of men, all while being led to battle by a one-eyed graying sexagenarian, then a bald battle priest with no prior experience in the ways of war. This leaves us with a few questions. Just how did the Hussites prove so effective on the battlefield? And where did they get that name from in the first place? What fueled their heretical movement, the most significant until the Reformation? And what ultimately came of their popular revolt, the largest in all the Middle Ages? Join me as we get the answers right here in Hussite country, the modern Czech Republic.
We're going to visit over 20 locations, recount every single battle of the Hussite Wars, and learn all about Jan Hus and Jan Žižka, the latter of whom died exactly 600 years to the day before the release of this YouTube documentary. So, without further ado, let's jump right in.
Přišla bída mora hlad, to neustojí žádnej chlap. Na kraj padnul děsnej smutek, kdo měl nohy ráno utek, děti v mouženský mají strach, kdo včera žil, dneska je prach. Už sej moji svatý muži, nechtěl bych bejt v jejich kůži, nám je to jedno a tak si dáme jedno.
Their ingenious solution to the mounted... Oh, no! No! Figures like Father Václav from Hostomice and Father Jan and Father Václav from... There's so many Jans. Let's begin with some context. Within the Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of the Czechs was always the exception to the rule. These people had their own identity, origin story, even their own patron saint, Svatý Václav, the fellow you can see behind me. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Czech remained the odd man out, the Slavic outlander in a predominantly German empire, mostly left to his own devices. That changed when the Luxembourgs entered the picture, ending an imperial interregnum with the papally sanctioned coronation of Henry VII, the Count of Luxembourg turned Holy Roman Emperor. The Luxembourgs knew from the start that if they wanted to keep Charlemagne's crown, they would need a bigger power base. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where Bohemia comes in. This kingdom was virtually up for grabs with the extinction of the Czech royal line, allowing the first Luxembourg emperor, Henry VII, to put his son, John the Blind, in charge. John was ultimately passed over for the imperial crown, leading the life of a knight-errant despite his steadily worsening eyesight. Had it not been for the Hussite general I mentioned earlier, who we'll return to very soon, John would have had no rival as far as blind men of action go. After he died in the faraway Battle of Crécy in 1346, he was followed by his bright and able son, the visionary Charles IV.
The German-Czech Charles succeeded where his father failed, making full use of his mixed ancestry to claim the imperial crown of Charlemagne and the royal crown of Saint Václav. Throughout his reign, Prague functioned as the Holy Roman Empire's de facto capital, expanded materially with the construction of Nové Město, aka Newtown, and intellectually with the University of Prague, Central Europe's first college. He also founded the spa town of Karlovy Vary, the castle of Karlstein, as well as Prague's famous bridge, Karlov Most. Under Charles' watchful leadership, the Kingdom of the Czechs experienced a golden age, miraculously dodging the Black Death and reaching a population of some 3 million. But as we all know from playing Kingdom Come Deliverance, the virtues of the father are not always the virtues of the son. In 1378, Charles was succeeded by his son and heir Václav, better known as Wenceslaus. His reputation is that of a drunken idler, and though it's a slightly unfair one, there is no denying that his younger brother Sigismund proved to be the stronger character. By 1410, the able and ruthless Sigismund secured the crowns of Germany and Hungary alike, leaving the Czech consolation crown to his older brother Wenceslaus. When Wenceslaus died in the year 1419, Sigismund claimed Bohemia all for himself. The events that followed made him one of the most vilified figures in this particular corner of the world. Here he was called the Red Dragon, the one who bathed this land in flames, all in his effort to roast the Hussite goose.
That brings us to the topic of how the Hussites got their name, which also explains the whole goose thing. It's a name that comes from the spiritual figurehead of this entire movement, Jan Hus, born here in the sleepy village of Husinec around the year 1372, in the twilight years of Charles IV's reign. Understanding the value of brevity, even in those days, Hus shortened this surname and brought it that much closer to Husa, the Czech word for goose. In a word, Jan Hus was Martin Luther without a printing press, a proto-reformer of the Catholic Church born exactly a century too early. Disappointingly, we don't know much about his early life here in Husinec. We know he had a father named Michael, but the name of his mother, his brother, as well as any general details about his upbringing are mostly lost to us. Had he always been destined to join the church? Was he always wise beyond his years? Did he wrestle with his faith like future reformers did? These are things we can only wonder about.
Někde was like intentionally emphasized, but they would use it for memory techniques.
Around 1385, Hus left his hometown and continued his studies across southern Bohemia. Half a decade later, he found himself in Prague, attracted by its newly opened university. Compared to Husinec, the medieval metropolis of Prague with its 4,000 homes and 35,000 people offered a lot more distractions, intellectually and otherwise. Later, Hus Huss would write about wasting his youth on chess and masquerades. Evidently, he had the habit, not unlike Martin Luther, of being just as hard on himself as he was on the Catholic Church. Just listen to how Huss described the suggestively named Feast of the Ass. What manifest outrage they perpetrate in the church by wearing masks. In my youthfulness, I also was once to my shame a masquerader. Who could possibly depict everything that transpired in Prague? Having designated a cleric, dressed in monstrous attire as bishop, they caused him to sit backwards on an ass with his face turned towards the tail. Then they take him into the church to mass. They carry a plate of broth in front of him and a jug or can of beer, and he eats in the church. I saw how the ass incenses the altars, and, raising one leg, calls out in a loud voice, "Boo!" and the priests carry before him large torches instead of candles. He rides from one altar to another altar, incensing as he goes. And I observed how the priests turned their fur-lined vestments inside and out and danced in the church. All the people watch this and laugh, thinking that all of this is holy and proper, since it appears in their rubric and in their statutes. Nice statutes, all right. What undisciplined abomination. When I was still young, both in years and in reason, I also adhered to this crazy rubric. But when the Lord God helped me understand the scriptures, I eliminated such notions from my weak intellect. In other words, Huss was letting off some steam. Back then, he was just a broke college student at the University of Prague. Too poor to afford a proper spoon, he reportedly fashioned one out of bread so he could eat his moldy peas with it. Even in this better recorded period of his life, it's hard to tell whether Huss felt a spiritual call to join the church. It may have been just as much of a practical choice, a way of upgrading from moldy peas and bread spoons.
Prior to the Hussite Revolution, the Catholic Church was a major jobs creator, as well as a landowner. It has been said that this institution owned anywhere from a quarter to half the land in Bohemia, though the sources do not confirm any official figure. The Hussites would go on to nationalize about 4 in every 5 church holdings, a process repeated a century later in Reformation strongholds like England. Though the question of land ownership was not a huge concern to Huss himself, it certainly didn't escape him, nor did the stories of priestly misbehavior, something he repeatedly condemned later in his career. First, there were the no-shows, the so-called barren bishops who never even visited their diocese. Then there were the priests who did show up and openly lived with their mistresses, scammed holy orders, peddled quack cures to women, and drank themselves senseless. Figures like Father Václav from Hostomice, and Father Jan and Father Jakob from Šaradice, all 3 of whom allegedly drank like fish. But perhaps the most scandalous story involves an unnamed minister, one who operated a thriving brothel straight from his home. The bulk of his clientele, fellow men of the cloth. None of this is to say that there were no good apples, or even that most of the apples were rotten ones. It's just that increasingly, they were all lumped into the same basket. The problem had become institutional, regarded then a little bit like late-stage capitalism is regarded today. Everything, and I mean everything, had its apportioned price. Baptisms, communions, weddings, funerals, all of it. You could even buy your way out of purgatory with the so-called papal indulgence, basically a skip-the-line-to-heaven pass. In the time of Martin Luther, this brand of papal greed was aptly summed up with a famous rhyme. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The Hussites had a different rhyme with the same meaning. Money is what the curia likes best. It empties many a purse and chest. If you are stingy with your marks, stay away from popes and patriarchs. But give them marks, and once their chests are filled, you will be absolved from all the bondage of your guilt. The complaints about drunkenness, corruption, and money-making schemes are all easy for us to grasp. But there was another complaint, a more slippery but no less important one relating to the ritual of Holy Communion.
This Christian rite is also called the Eucharist, or Thanksgiving, in commemoration of the Last Supper. It involves the use of bread to represent the body, and wine to represent the blood of the Lord and Savior. In the Middle Ages, it went without saying that at the moment of transubstantiation, the blood and body of Christ were real, every bit as real as the divine disfavor that followed if the sacred was somehow profaned. To echo the words of one historian, Holy Communion was basically the medieval equivalent of approaching a nuclear reactor. So, rather than risk a spiritual Chernobyl, the Catholic Church gradually restricted the use of communion wine. By the late Middle Ages, only priests were allowed to drink from the sacred chalice that contained the wine or blood of Christ. The unwashed masses were forbidden from doing so. That way, the sacred would not be profaned. This gave the Eucharist an exclusionary, almost elitist dynamic. Believe it or not, the medieval chalice controversy lay at the very beating heart of the Hussite movement, proving just as important as anything else I have mentioned, if not more so. But where was Huss in all of this? The last time we checked up on him, he was still a hungry undergrad at the University of Prague, eating peas with a bread spoon. Well, by the year 1400, Huss had earned both a bachelor's and master's degree, becoming a priest and professor at his alma mater. To get to this point, he had studied hard and scrimped and saved, singing in a church choir. Now it seemed he could finally enjoy the fruits of his labor, only something prevented him from doing so. Something best compared to a snake in a tree or a weed in a garden. As an educated man living in the country's biggest city, he could sense which way the wind was blowing, and the reform-minded faculty of his alma mater had sown the seeds of doubt deep within him. A couple of years later, these seeds sprouted into the weeds of heresy, the instigating factor being the arrival of John Wycliffe's works. Wycliffe had been a dissident professor at Oxford University, and, like Huss, was far ahead of his time. He had translated the Bible into English, advocated for the equal punishment of mortal sins, and criticized the accumulation of church wealth, as well as the sale of skip-the-line-to-heaven passes. At every step, Wycliffe insisted his critics refute him by citing Scripture, pioneering a first principles argument used again and again during the Reformation. Ultimately, Wycliffe would be to Huss what Huss would be to Luther. More than anywhere else in the Garden of Christendom, it was in Bohemia that his ideas took root, in no small part thanks to Huss. In the next few years, Huss became a dean at his alma mater, his tenure coinciding with the nationalization of this institution and the departure of most of its German students and professors. The Czech population was abuzz from the cross-pollination of nationalism and religiosity, and between his countless lectures and sermons, Huss was becoming a very busy bee. The hive mind met in Bethlehem Chapel, where Huss's audience regularly filled up every nook and cranny. Something like 3,000 people came here for his sermons, among them men, women, children, laborers, merchants, politicians, and even the queen of the hive herself, Sophia, the wife of King Wenceslaus. She would have been accompanied by a mercenary turned chamberlain, the one-eyed Jan Valta himself, whose sting would soon be felt on every Hussite battlefield. Yet it was here in this newly built chapel that the first Hussite volley was fired, if only metaphorically. During a 10-year span, Huss gave between 3,000 and 3,500 sermons, averaging almost one per day. He must have been one of few people then or now not to take Sundays off. Besides the fact that Huss was addressing all the hot-button issues of his day, a big part of his popularity was his unadorned manner of speaking. Huss gave it to the people straight, not in Latin, but in everyday Czech, allowing everyone to understand him.
To establish a sense of oneness with his audience, he would habitually address people by their occupation. Tailors, clerks, shoemakers, and cobblers, his voice would ring out, "You are all my beloved in Christ."
But as his fame at home grew, so too did his infamy abroad. In 1415, Jan Hus was summoned to the German city of Constance to prove he wasn't a heretic. The problem was that at this point, that would be a difficult thing for him to prove. The terms Hussite and Wycliffite had both become bywords for heresy, and there is little reason to wonder why. During his many sermons, Huss had loudly and repeatedly broken with church precedent, questioning any practice not explicitly rooted in the Bible, this amounting to a great many of them as it turns out. Unlike the reformers of the next century, who aimed to tear the whole thing down, Huss was more interested in reforming the church, even as he slowly found himself outside its confines. At this point, he was also in exile from Prague, having ruffled the feathers of one too many German authorities. All of this explains why he made the fateful decision to attend the Council of Constance, possibly the second occasion he left the country, but certainly the last. It was none other than Sigismund who promised Huss safe conduct, the future Holy Roman Emperor himself. So what could possibly go wrong? It would take about a month for Huss to find out. After arriving in Constance on the 3rd of November, he was thrown in prison by the 28th, spending the next 7 months chained up, underfed, and ill. He stood accused of going against hundreds of years of institutional wisdom and was given multiple chances to repent. Again and again, he demanded his accusers disprove him by making specific references to the Bible. Because they could or would not do so, Huss refused to recant anything whatsoever, displaying all the naive single-mindedness of a born martyr. On the 6th of July, 1415, they burned him alive. Though forced to wear a dunce cap, Huss approached the pyre with a saintly dignity, chanting a sacred hymn as the flames engulfed him. Later, it was said that his final words were some version of the following: "Now you may burn a goose, but in 100 years will come a swan you cannot roast or boil." This was an awfully convenient prophecy for Martin Luther, with whom the swan is often associated as part of his sigil. It is doubly convenient that Luther issued his 95 Theses in 1517, an event that marks the official start date of the Reformation and almost perfectly coincides with the 100th anniversary of Huss's martyrdom. The story of the swan is best saved for another time. For now, let us turn to the historian Thomas A. Fudge, a leading authority on all things Hussite. The judicial process against Jan Hus and his summary execution electrified Bohemia. Alive, Huss had been moderate, even conservative. Dead, he became a martyr, and his name and memory appropriated to validate doctrines and practices he clearly would not have approved of. Fudge goes on. Remove Calvary and its aftermath, and Christ is little more than another itinerant Jewish rabbi. Had Huss survived Constance, at best he would be remembered as a minor Catholic reformer of the later Middle Ages. As with all martyrs then, Huss became most powerful in death. And it is this very moment, the moment the goose was roasted, that the second part of our story was set into motion. When news of the execution reached Prague, a council of 60 barons convened to discuss what to make of it. Fittingly, they met back in Bethlehem Chapel, where many of them would have attended Huss's sermons. Unsurprisingly, the barons condemned the treachery at Constance, categorically denying that Huss had been a heretic. Outside the chapel, the mood was even testier. The common people had no patience for any debates about what constituted heresy. They were out for blood. Soon news of their canine fury made it to Sigismund, and he vowed to kill every Hussite he could get his hands on. Then, the calm before the storm, a period from 1415 to 1418 when the Council of Constance formally came to a close. Having addressed the Hussite heresy, the first bullet point on their agenda, the council was freed up to end a 40-year schism within the Catholic Church. This was accomplished with the election of Martin V, the last pope to choose that name in light of what Martin Luther went on to do in the following century. In the meantime, the ironically named Pope Martin took a hardline stance against Bohemia's befouling heresy. He wrote more than 500 letters concerning the, in his words, disgusting Hussites and their nefarious pestilence. To him, it was quite clear that this irrational grossness had to be torn out, root and stem, and toward that end he begged Sigismund to take action.
In the whirlwind year of 1419, the Pope's deepest, darkest prayers came true. As you'll recall from earlier, it was during that year that Wenceslaus died, prompting Sigismund to press his claim on Bohemia. Just 17 days prior, on the 30th of July, a Hussite congregation made its way through Prague. Eventually, they reached the building you see behind me, the new town hall here in Charles Square, then the largest square in medieval Europe.
They were led by yet another Jan Zalewski, now the most important preacher in the city. He had brought his gaggle of geese here hoping to secure the release of Hussite prisoners, a prospect the town council staunchly opposed. The scene that followed is right out of Game of Thrones, with the Hussites easily filling in for the faith militant once you trade sparrows for geese.
In the chaos that followed, it seems that Zalewski was pelted with a stone, which got the Hussites so riled up that they stormed this hall and started dropping council members out of the window. The event has since become known as the Defenestration of Prague, and it marks the official start date of the Hussite Wars. In case you're curious, this highfalutin word comes from the Latin de for down from and fenestra for window. Funnily enough, if I had $1 for every one of Prague's defenestrations, I'd have $3. That's not a lot, but at the current exchange rate, it's the equivalent of 70 Czech koruny. More than enough to get a pint here. The period of hostility following the defenestration was temporarily suspended with a truce in November 1419. But this ceasefire proved too little, too late. Prague remained a powder keg, and already the tendrils of heresy stretched far beyond it. Here in southern Bohemia, something like 50,000 men, women, and children flocked to the hilltop near Bohemia Castle.
It was in these parts that rogue priests defied the decree of Constance, administering the sacred chalice to everyday people. Holy Communion probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you're looking to have some fun. But back then, taking the sacrament the Hussite way would have been nothing short of exhilarating. Not only were you breaking a long-time taboo, you believed in that moment with all your heart and soul that you were drinking the blood of Christ. And you were doing it up high in the hills of southern Bohemia, joining a long tradition of mountain revelation. It was on a mountaintop that Abraham nearly sacrificed his son, that Moses received the 10 Commandments, and that Christ was transfigured. One day soon, it was said, Christ would also return on a mountaintop, bringing the world to an end and taking the worthy to God's kingdom. This got the Hussites thinking. Maybe it was time to get their affairs in order, and maybe the best way to do that was to create God's kingdom in miniature. That way, when Christ returned, you would see that they were worthy. Toward that end, the Hussites founded this city right here, the city of Tabor, building on old foundations to create something entirely new.
The name came from Mount Tabor in Jerusalem, and soon the term would refer both to a resident of the city as well as to the most radical wing of the Hussite movement. How radical, you may ask? To answer that question, all we need to do is take a look at Tabor's founding document, which reads like something out of 1820 and not 1420. Henceforth at Hradiště and Tabor there is nothing which is mine or thine. Rather, all things in the community shall be held in common for all time, and no one is permitted to hold private property. The one who does commit sins mortally. No longer shall there be a reigning king or a ruling lord, for there shall be no servitude any longer. All taxes and exactions shall cease, and no one shall compel another to subjection. All shall be equal as brothers and sisters. The Taborites were completely serious about the abolition of debt, taxation, rent, private property, and lordship. But they also had to be realistic. They were living in a time of war, and war was expensive. That's why it didn't take long for business to return to usual. Taxes were resumed, shops were reopened, and 4 hetmen or military captains were named, among them One-Eye Zizka, whose statue you can see behind me. Zizka here had been itching for a fight since the defenestration, and he left Prague in protest of the ill-fated ceasefire of 1419. Already by the close of that year, 2 skirmishes took place between Royalist and Hussite forces, the first one at Żywohost and the second one here at Nekmir. Zizka was in command at Nekmir, where the Hussite War wagon made its humble debut. As the Hussite Wars progressed, what began as a convoy of 7 reconverted farm carts gradually turned into the Vozovi Hrat. It was the Hussites' unique contribution to the art of war, their ingenious solution to the battle tank of that era, the mounted knight. It was here at Nekmir that the Hussites set the tone for the rest of the war, besting a force 5 times their size and living to fight another day. When the campaigning season resumed in the spring of 1420, Zizka and his followers faced the exact same odds. Accounting for the women and children, it was 400 of them against 2,000 royalists, superior not only in numbers, but also in equipment, training, and cavalry. The royalists chased their prey to a pond near the town of Sudomir, where they expected to trample the Hussite geese beneath their horses' hooves. These anti-Hussite forces called themselves the Zhelezny Pani, the Iron Lords, and they were joined by a detachment of the Knights Hospitaller. Against them, the Hussites had a pitiful 9 horses, but they also had 12 wagons and a whole bunch of flails, firearms, and polearms. They also had the one and only Jan Zizka. Born only 70 kilometers or 44 miles southeast of here, Zizka knew exactly how to exploit the marshy terrain, positioning his gun-carrying wagons in the mud and his troops, if they can be called troops at this point, behind the wagons. Thanks to their wagon fort and an early sunset, the Hussites made it to nightfall, staging a miraculous escape thereafter amid the smoke, fog, and dark. The whole experience left the Royalists dazed and confused, with many of the once proud Iron Lords reporting that their swords and spears had been useless against the Hussites' iron hides. Zizka could not afford to rest on his laurels, not once news from the south finally reached him. Pope Martin V had officially declared an anti-Hussite crusade, turning a civil conflict into a full-blown coalition war, with some 33 nations answering the call to arms. The next few months were spent trading blows across southern Bohemia, with settlements being taken and retaken, all while crusading forces poured across the Czech border. In June, some 80,000 of these crusaders amassed before the walls of Prague, which was under the joint protection of Zizka's Taborites and the more moderate Hussite wing based in the capital. Despite their huge numbers, the crusaders shied away from the prospect of a full frontal assault. Instead, they planned to wait the defenders out, a strategy that would require them to seize the forts surrounding Prague and thereby disrupt the city's supply lines. One of these forts crowned the hill I'm standing on now, where the decisive engagement was fought in mid-July 1420. According to the chronicles, the climactic moment came when Zizka and a priest emerged carrying the bread and wine of the Eucharist. This act apparently had the dual effect of rallying the few dozen or so Czech defenders and scaring off the Austrian and Saxon cavalry detachments, whose greater numbers were negated by the slope's narrow path. In actuality, it seems that the Crusaders would have had the upper hand had it not been for the steep slope they were forced to fight on, combined with the Hussite counterattack through the nearby vineyards. Pure hammer and anvil stuff. Though Zizka was in command of the fort, it is unknown whether he was actually on the hill at the time of the battle. Nonetheless, the slope became known as Zizka's Hill, and also as the Mountain of the Chalice. Today goes by a third name, Vitkov Hill, but Zizka's memory is still honored with the bronze equestrian statue in front of me, the third largest in the world. After the back and forth struggle for Vitkov Hill, Prague remained a battleground until the Hussites besieged the stronghold of Vyšehrad, which I'm at right now. Though the recalcitrant defenders resorted to eating their own horses in order to survive, they ended up raising the white flag of surrender on the 1st of November, 1420. Sigismund scarcely had enough time to place the crown of St. Wenceslas on his noggin before he gunned it east, first to Moravia and then to Hungary. Earlier that year, 2 other royalist armies had been defeated at Tábor and Most, bringing the First Crusade to a humiliating finish. The Hussites had elevated their cause through military victory, but this brings us to a fundamental question. What were they fighting for? What was this whole cause all about? Though already the Hussite movement was diverging into a few distinct factions, the most notable being the Praguer and Taborite branches, everyone could agree on 4 key points, the so-called 4 decrees of Prague. Number 1, freedom to preach. The Hussites wanted to spread their way of worship to every corner of Bohemia without fear of persecution. Number 2, equal punishment for mortal sins, no matter your social class. In other words, no more indulgences. Number 3, enforced poverty of the church, the nationalization of the sacred institution's lands and wealth so it could focus on what really matters, guiding souls on their way to salvation. And last but certainly not least, number 4, the freedom to drink from the chalice. Communion in both kinds, sub utraque specia in Latin. Later, it would be this Latin phrase that gave the moderate Hussites, the Utraquists, their name. In September 1421, the Crusaders invaded Bohemia and besieged the town of Žatec. From the very beginning, things did not go according to plan. Žatec held firm, withstanding 6 assaults before the Crusaders slunk away in ignominy. Attempting to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, the Crusaders marched here to Kutná Hora. At that time, the city was second only to Prague in wealth and opulence, thanks to its silver mines and mint. But it was still dependent on the capital militarily. The problem was that even with the Praguers' help, the city stood no chance against Sigismund's forces. That is why the Praguers set aside their differences with the Taborites and summoned Jan Žižka, who received a king's welcome in the capital city, despite the fact that he was now completely blind. From there, Žižka and his forces made for Kutná Hora, arriving on the 9th of December and gaining a 12-day head start on Sigismund. But as the Hussites made their preparations for the siege to follow, they had no idea about the plot twist in store for them. The garrison of Kutná Hora had reached a deal with Sigismund, and on the 21st of December, they commenced a purge of Hussite loyalists within the city. Meanwhile, Žižka and his men were right outside the city walls in their wagon fort, protected for the time being by the cover of darkness. Both sides knew that come the morning, the Hussite cause would be doomed, its commander killed, its forces scattered, and its second most important city seized. But, as the historian Thomas A. Fudge put it, the Crusaders failed to reckon with one essential fact. For a blind man, there was no need to wait for the light of day to fight. That very night marked the first moment that firearms were used for offensive warfare. It must have been a sight to see, with the sprawling Hussite war wagon surging forward, all while those within unloaded guns and cannons on the startled and sleepy Crusaders. But in case you thought Zizka would lay low after the close call at Kutná Hora, think again. He was not one to let a single night go to waste, let alone an entire campaigning season. And so, as the Crusaders settled into their winter quarters, the Hussites struck on the 6th of January, 1422. The ambush happened near the town of Nebovidi. The Crusaders probably wondered why they heard the trees speaking and then singing in Czech. In any case, the mystery would have been resolved as soon as they saw the Hussites rushing toward them with flails and maces, chanting their battle hymns and causing a full-scale royalist retreat. When Sigismund got the news, he ordered that Kutná Hora be razed to the ground, judging it too important to fall to the Hussites. But even in this instance, Zizka outmaneuvered him, chasing the Crusaders all the way to Kutná Hora and preventing the city from being destroyed. But that was still not the end of it. On January 8th, the Hussites ran headlong into royalist forces near the town of Německý Brod, which translates to Deutschenbrod in German and German Ford in English. As you can probably guess, it was home to a majority German, majority Catholic population. And because Sigismund wasn't willing to give the town up without a fight, he decided to stand his ground. But that is precisely what Zizka wanted. And when he and his Hussites swept in, guns blazing, the battle quickly turned into a royalist rout. Not only did the Hussites capture the enemy's standards, artillery, and supply train, they forced Sigismund to ride non-stop through the night so he could get away. Though the fleeing king ordered the survivors to screen his retreat and maintain the town's defense, these instructions were flatly ignored. The survivors were more concerned with securing their own salvation, which lay across the Sázava River. This right here is the bridge they came across, since rebuilt for the modern world. Back then, it was a narrow wooden bridge, too narrow for the royalists to cross with the Hussites breathing down their necks. But there was another way. The river had frozen over because of how harsh the winter was. So the royalists slowly shuffled out onto the ice. Then panic set in, and hundreds of men and horses were thrashing in the icy river, weighed down with arms and armor. By dawn, another 500 were dead.
Though the settlement was fortified, one local tells us that the latest archaeological evidence suggests that there was a gap in the defenses, apparently the result of a cost-cutting measure in the preceding century. In any case, the Hussites may have noticed this oversight and exploited it, and soon the town was reduced to rubble. It was one of the worst atrocities the Hussites committed, and Zizka, now almost completely blind, was powerless to stop it. Between 1,000 and 2,000 people were slaughtered, their bodies left to wolves and dogs as the settlement was abandoned. Thankfully, life returned to this place after 7 years' time, and gradually the settlement was rebuilt. Today, it's a city of almost 25,000 people, and it's gone by the name Havlíčkův Brod, after a local Czech author, ever since the Second World War.
Hopla! Zde prosím škopíček pro mou tanečnici.
Děkuji, pane, ale nezlobte se, já bych chtěla, abyste do něj dal i vodku.
1424 was to be the first year of the Third Crusade and the last year of Zizka's life. By summer, the one-eyed general was moving southeast along the Labe when he and his men were cornered between the river and a much larger force of crusaders. The Hussites were trapped, their only recourse, the trusty wagon fort. A siege then commenced, one reminiscent of Kutná Hora in that its outcome was all but certain. Zizka could try to blast his way out as he had done in the past, but this time the Crusaders were ready for that. That is why virtually everyone at Sigismund's side declared that Zizka's days were numbered. Everyone except Sigismund, who just kept repeating the same thing. He will escape. On the morning of June 5th, Zizka did just that, proving you can teach an old dog new tricks. When the Crusaders awoke, they found his camp completely empty. Somehow, the Hussites had forded the river in the dead of night, leaving the Crusaders of that time and the historians of our time equally baffled.
To se víc říká v Kalifornii. Tam to je úplné obecná informace, protože my jsme pouští samozřejmě, že? Tak máme ty rattlesnakes. Nevím, jak to přesně chytíme. Tam je taky ten blbej dráče, ale koukej, jak jsem to zatím chytil teďka. Já jsem to tam schoval, že? Trošku from the side.
A co kdybys jako, a to nemyslím, kdybys to vyloženě jako zvedl ručně, že by to...
After besieging Přibyslev in the close of 1424, Žižka died here in Žižkové Pole either to plague or a diseased carbuncle. Unconquered to the last, his dying wish was to have his skin turned into a war drum. That way he might continue leading his troops even beyond the grave.
With their father gone, his soldiers called themselves sirotsi, orphans. Even his enemies had to honor him by saying that it was the finger of God, rather than any mortal hand that extinguished him. Had it not been for his age and character, the old soldier might have become the Czech Caesar. Instead, he is remembered here as Žižka of the Chalice, much as he always intended to be. You would think that the Pope and Emperor would have learned their lesson after making their first martyr, but here they were, believing the Hussites a spent force after just making a second one out of Žižka. Thus began their fourth and penultimate crusade in 1426, the bloody highlight of which was the Battle of Ústí nad Labem. There, the Crusaders learned just how wrong they were about the Hussite cause, reportedly losing thousands against a slightly smaller force with 500 war wagons. Accounts of the aftermath are brutal, comparing the unburied German corpses to bundles of grain during harvest time, whose blood colored a nearby stream red as their bones remain there, supposedly, to this very day. Yet the Fourth Crusade would only come to a close the following year near the silver mining settlement of Stříbro.
If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it probably is a duck, though the same cannot be said of a goose. When the two sides met near the town of Stříbro, the Crusaders attempted to adopt the Hussite wagon strategy, a decision that backfired spectacularly. Pretty soon they were being chased through the forest of Šumava, cut down in droves until the official death toll reached 100,000. This figure is no doubt a gross exaggeration, but it still gives some sense of the scale of the slaughter. It also explains the wrath of Cardinal Beaufort, who tore up an imperial standard when he heard the news.
At this point, you're probably wondering who it was that commanded Hussite forces at Stříbro and the Labe. Žižka had left behind big shoes to fill, but the Taborite known as Prokop proved capable and fiery enough to step into them. Half Czech, half German, this tonsured priest had been forbidden from stepping foot on the battlefield at the start of the Hussite Wars. After all, a man of the cloth was supposed to be focused on guiding souls to salvation. But at this late stage in the game, exceptions were made in the face of military necessity. After the Battle of Stříbro, Prokop besieged the town of Tachov, ending the Fourth Crusade with a bloody assault. Such was the carnage, apparently, that there is a road running through the center of the city today known as Krvava ulica, Bloody Street.
A contemporary account bewailed the complete and utter failure of the Fourth Crusade, and because of the Hussites' rowdy reputation, the same account suggested that the whole venture would have had a higher chance of success if instead of so many fighting men, the empire had sent as many prostitutes.
Thus began the rowdy Hussites' magnificent rides, or Spanile Yizdi, under the not-so-priestly leadership of Prokop. These rides took them to Silesia, Saxony, Hungary, and other places that had supported the crusading cause. The Hussites even made it to Danzig, and one German historian records that they greeted the sea with a wild Czech song about God's warriors, filling their water bottles with brine in token that the Baltic once more obeyed the Slavs. This period lasted about 4 years, from 1427 to 1431, when the fifth and final anti-Hussite crusade was finally proclaimed.
On the 14th of August, the Crusaders and Hussites met for a final time in the town of Domažlice, depicted in this painting you can see behind me in the town's official museum. As the story goes, the Crusaders turned tail and ran the moment they heard the Hussite battle hymn, made all the more threatening by the war wagons that thundered toward them. One way or another, tens of thousands of Crusaders ended up fleeing into the forests surrounding this settlement, with their commander, Cardinal Cesarini, losing his golden cross, red robes, and Cardinal's beretta in the process.
But though this battle marked the end of bloodshed between Hussites and Crusaders, it did not mark the end of internal strife within Bohemia. Somehow, while defending against 5 crusades and launching numerous raids into surrounding countries, the Hussites found the time to fight amongst themselves. Fundamentally, there had always been that battle between radicals and moderates, then Taborites and Praguers, and now Prokop against almost everyone else. By 1434, it was clear there could only be one path forward. The time for talking had passed, and the 2 Hussite factions met near the town of Lipany to finally put their differences to rest. Feigning retreat, the moderates were able to lure the radicals out of their wagon fort, at which point they sprung their awful trap.
Out in the open, the radicals were ripped apart by cannon and gunfire from the opposition's wagon fort, and also by a well-coordinated cavalry attack. In the aftermath, Prokop lay dead. Surrounded by the enemy cavalry, it is reported, with pardonable exaggeration, that he almost single-handedly reversed the course of the battle. Felling many a foe before finally being struck down with an arrow, Prokop fell wearied with conquering, rather than conquered himself. The moderates had been victorious, and the Hussite Wars were over. Well, almost over. As it turns out, there was still one radical leader with some fight left in him, the guy whose statue you see beside me. His name was Jan Valta of Duba, and for the next 3 years he continued to resist Sigismund's forces from Sion, a fortress near Kutna Hora. Nor did Valta stop fighting after he was dragged out of this fortress in chains. Still refusing to acknowledge Sigismund as king, Valta was tortured so bad his intestines fell out. After that, they hung him and his men from a 3-story gallows in Prague's Old Town Square.
For everyone else, life finally went on the way it usually did, free of invasion and insurrection alike. Though the radicals had been defeated at last, their demise came not at the hands of Crusaders, but other Hussites. That is why the 4 decrees of Prague, freedom to preach, equal punishment for mortal sins, enforced poverty of the church, and communion in both kinds, became enshrined as the Compacts of Prague. And though these compacts did not go as far as the radicals had hoped, they still marked the first moment in history when the Catholic Church had to backpedal, the first time a pope had to tolerate heretics in the Garden of Christendom. The Hussites had done what the Cathars, Waldensians, and Wycliffites could only dream of, paving the path for the Protestant Reformation by exposing the cracks in the Catholic foundation. Thomas A. Fudge put it like this: the day of Huss's execution not only marked the end of his life, but also signaled the beginning of something new. No longer would kings stand barefoot in the snow and yield to the unbending and non-negotiable will of popes as Henry IV did at Canossa. Religious and social dissent could no longer be deterred absolutely. Jan Hus and the revolution bearing his name helped to change the way power and authority were understood and administered, both in the church and in political structures. Bold ideas quite capable of revolutionizing the human mind, and by extension the Latin Church and Western civilization followed in Huss's wake. By the time of Martin Luther, the Czech nation was in the backseat once again, where it tended to be the most comfortable. Its population was maybe 1.5 million, half of what it was during the time of Jan Hus. After Sigismund, the throne passed to the famous Habsburgs, though at one point, the kingdom finally got its first and only Hussite monarch, Jiří z Poděbrad. Under Jiří's successor, the religious peace of Kutná Hora was declared in 1485. This is considered the definitive end to the Hussite Wars, even if hostilities had, for the most part, ended more than half a century ago. And that was that, until the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, which rocked all of Europe, Bohemia included. For the Czechs, the shockwave came noticeably early in the Battle of the White Mountain, or Bílá Hora, in 1620. In said battle, Hussite rebel fought Catholic imperialist once again, but compared to their forefathers, the Hussites of the 17th century put up much less of a fight, with their defeat in this confrontation paving the way for a recatholicization of Bohemia under Habsburg rule. The Peace of Kutná Hora was swept under the rug, and today it is the Peace of Westphalia that we study and remember, the peace that ended the 30 Years' War and begrudgingly initiated a new era of religious toleration, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm is religion, but ironically not in Bohemia.
It is here at this cairn that our story finally reaches its conclusion, for it is here that the Battle of White Mountain was fought, 205 years after the death of Jan Hus and 404 years before the release of this YouTube documentary. In closing, I want to thank you all for joining me on this magnificent ride through Bohemia, and as the Hussites would say, Spanem Bohem.